think let's make a start. We're a minute past. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us for the session today. I personally am really excited. Anything to do with arts and humanities and kind of listening to research in that area just makes me quite excited. So we're really happy to be joined by Claire and Agata today. So what we'll do, I'll give some brief introductions and then Claire will give her talk and Agata will then follow. We'll open it up to Q&A for around 10-15 minutes, and then we will go out into breakout rooms depending on how many people that we get. So just to recreate that kind of conference vibe for everybody. So really happy to welcome Claire Stainthorp, the Lupin Trust Early Career Fellow in the Department of English at Queen Mary University of London. And Claire's going to be talking about debates and dialogues in 19th century atheist networks. And Agata Lulkowska, who's a senior lecturer in film production at Staffordshire University. And Agata is going to be talking about decolonising local knowledge through practice-based collaborative research. So Claire, if I hand over to you, and if you'd like to start sharing your screen, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I think that should be up. Yeah, great. So sorry, I'm just going to minimize a few things so I can't see myself speaking. So I've got this new project that I started in January of this year. So it's quite an early stage project called Reading the Freethought Movement, Atheism, Agnosticism and Secularism, 1866 to 1907, which should hopefully become a book by the end of the 3-year fellowship. So what I was going to speak with you about today were the kind of contours of some elements of this project, thinking broadly about the history of atheism or free thought, the function of periodicals and texts in developing networks and communities in the 19th century, and thinking about how using a literary perspective to look at sources that have been more often used to think in the sort of historical discipline can bring nuance and new understanding to so thinking about belief and society and these sort of bigger questions during the 19th century from my perspective. So what I'm really interested in is, I haven't got lots of slides, I've just got this one holding slide really to show you the kind of sources, the kind of text that I'm actually looking at. And so here you've got kind of randomly chosen front pages, but one of the Free Thinker and one of the Agnostic Journal and Eclectic Review. And these are either weekly or fortnightly papers which are priced, you can see here, one's 1 penny, one's 2 pennies. And so it's very much for the free thought community, which is a largely working class and artisan class communities who are, some of them will be identifying as atheists or agnostics or secularists. But I really love this term free thinker because it speaks to the breadth of free thought. So it's not just about challenging the status quo in terms of orthodox religions, but it's also about thinking critically about society and politics, the way that quite often religious structures are going to be dictating the place of women in society or the way that class functions in Britain. So it's thinking freely and broadly about how we might change British society in order to make it a more equitable, fair and modern society as well. There's a sense of evolving towards a better Britain, I suppose. So the aspect of this that I'm going to just talk about briefly today is the debates and dialogues, and how the idea of debate and dialogue is really important to free thinkers and how that manifests in these kinds of periodicals. Because obviously the fundamental of a debate, a dialogue, is to be challenging someone. It's to be sparring back and forth between two different points of view. And these are both literal and imaginative. They are sort of formal and informal. So there are, for example, literal debates. You have important free thinkers such as Charles Bradlaugh or Annie Besant or George W. Foote, who are going on lecture tours and And parts of these tours around Britain will also sometimes involve debates on public stages between this sort of high-profile freethinker and a clergyman. And they're talking about these sort of big questions. Is there a God? What is religion? The veracity of the Bible very often comes under debate. And obviously there are people in the room that is a public debate, but what makes it a sort of larger debate, a more national debate, is that they then often publish verbatim the transcripts of these debates into periodicals such as this. And this allows people to have the right to reply. So you have correspondence columns in which the rank and file freethinker, the ones who don't have the platform to literally stand on the stage, are given a textual stage by being allowed to respond to the ideas that have been put forward in this debate. They're not echo chambers. You get theists, so people who are believers will respond, as well as people who are sort of radical atheists. And then you also have people responding to these responses. So over a series of issues, you can have an ongoing debate back and forth between various kinds of thinkers. But you also have imagined debates as well. You have imagined dialogues. And the most prominent of these were published during the 1880s in another of the periodicals called the National Reformer, called Doubts in Dialogue. And the scenario of these is generally that you have a believer and you have a free thinker, and they are imagined to have a conversation. So for example, the unbeliever to the Christian priest. And the scenario is generally that the freethinker is highlighting the contradictions in religious texts, highlighting the hypocrisies in religious teaching and the way that churches function. Generally, the freethinker wins, I guess, unsurprisingly, given that that's the context where it's being published. But what's really interesting here is there are some different elements to the sort of function of these. You might see them as a script. I haven't yet found any evidence of this, but you could imagine that readers might take these ideal dialogues and try and bring them into the real world and actually use them to sort of talk through challenging ideas with believers. But there's also an element to which it now allows people in that sort of Socratic method, that sort of elite way of education that sort of exists in universities at the time, that you need to be able to hold your own in a political or a philosophical debate in order to really show your political acumen, your skill, and your citizenship to an extent. So one of the elements of radicalism within free thought is the support for the suffrage cause. In the 19th century, obviously, women don't have the vote, but also a large proportion of men don't have the vote, and that's sort of class and income based. And so the idea that many of the people who are reading these papers can't actually show their citizenship, can't get involved on a national political stage because they can't actually vote. But what they can do is show that they would be able to hold their own in the political sphere by thinking, having the skill, having the ability to debate, to have a formal dialogue on big issues of the day, and big philosophical issues, ontological and epistemological issues as well, thinking about the philosophy of belief and society and how it functions in society. And yeah, so it's actually providing people with a different format in which to sort of acknowledge and show their right to citizenship, because they can actually engage in this manner. So this is obviously a very quick whistle stop sort of way of sort of showing the kinds of ways that thinking about how the form of text is actually developing the discourses around really big questions around sort of belief in society, and that these sorts of periodicals are providing a space for free thinkers to develop their ideas, both as spectators, but also as participants in debates and dialogues that are really seeking to reshape what British society looks like and making it into a more equitable society. And where I'll leave it, I suppose, is to say that, of course, these are not questions that have stopped, you know, they're very current in terms of free thought might be rendered as free speech, and the kind of free speech debates that are continuing to happen around who does and doesn't get to have their say and be listened to. All of these things are still very much present in the society today. And so I'm really interested later on in the project in thinking about how we can use these contexts to think about the place of religion and belief and debate today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. A really interesting talk, and I already have some burning questions in my mind. But as soon as I put in the chat, it sounds like a 19th century Twitter, giving that platform to people to kind of have that exchange, those dialogues via a periodical. So really, really interesting. I'd like to invite Agata now to give her presentation. So if I hand over to you, Agata, if you'd like to start sharing your screen when you're ready.
Lovely. Thank you. Can you see my screen? Wonderful, fantastic. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really, really excited to be here this morning. And so what I'm going to be talking about over the next 10 minutes or so are two things I'm really, really passionate about. First one being practice-based research. And the second one is a question of decolonizing local knowledge. So because if I really wanted to talk about it at length, I would probably keep you here until tomorrow. What I decided to do is to divide this short talk into three main sections. So the first one is this idea of what practice-based research in creative arts really is, and perhaps this division and dichotomy between the creative practice, very often thought of as accessible, inclusive for general audiences, versus research, which tends to be seen as hermetic, exclusive, and very often made for academia itself. The second question is this idea of decolonized approach to local knowledge, but also practice-based research in relation to collaborations. So I'll just give you some ideas based on a case study of a big research project I did a couple of years ago, and then something I'm kind of continuing to working on going forward. And the last big question, something we will be building more answers towards the end of this presentation and going forward, hopefully, is this idea of dissemination and impact. So who is the audience for the outcomes where creative exploration meets academic rigor? And I'd like to kind of point you to this motto here. So who has the right to represent whom, for what reason, and with what intention? I think this has been something which really, really made me think quite a lot when I was looking at this idea of practice-based research and how it kind of varies from purely creative artistic research forms. So let's start here. I've been doing photography since I was really, really young. And before I got into research, I was exhibiting my photography in many different places. And I started thinking when I moved to research and I started using photography as a method, photography and video, that sometimes it actually might be quite challenging to look at some photographs and really know which one was taken for research and which was taken purely for an exhibition. And unless I tell you what my research is about, you might not necessarily know which of these photographs were taken for which reason. And I find it quite interesting because it will link us to this idea of outcomes and where they can be presented and what kind of impact they can have on society going forward. But the case study I wanted to present you very briefly is the work I did with a small indigenous group of filmmakers in Colombia. So long story short, it was a group which sadly was subject to violence and displacement due to the situation in the region. And what they decided to do is to reach to filmmaking to communicate the worries and find external allies. And of course, it wasn't a very straightforward process because we're talking about a community which didn't have access to electricity, let alone filmmaking equipment and skills, but they managed to do it. And as they continued with their work, they started looking at the existing films which were made about them in the region by external filmmakers. And as a result, they started questioning Western politics of representation. And they wanted to be the ones who were talking for themselves. So they basically gained the agency, and they say, well, we were perfectly capable to speak for ourselves. So they become this voice of the voiceless. And the question of ownership of the image is also about what happens with the films and videos taken in the region once the makers leave the place and distribute the things in their own context. And I'll have some interesting quote in a moment about that. Now, again, almost 10 years fast forward, what happens? They started presenting their films in multiple international film festivals. They were invited to different talks all over the world, and effectively, they became ambassadors of Indigenous emancipation through the process of filmmaking. Now, what was my role in this project? So initially, before I went to the region, I obviously did quite an extensive research, just trying to understand what's going on. I found it rather fascinating. But as I arrived in Colombia, what I realized that all the preconceptions I've created based on the secondary research was just really something I had to rethink completely and bring it back to square one and just really rethink the whole idea of what I was doing. So for a couple of months, I became part of the indigenous crew, and I was working with them as they were filming in different regions, going from village to the village. And as I was doing this, I was also documenting the process. And effectively, what I realized, and the more time passes, I realized that what this research was about is more about me as a practice-based researcher, coming from artistic background and just trying to understand how I can use these methods to apply to this kind of very, very fascinating, but also complex research, and less about what they were already doing. It was just really, really fascinating. So this is the quote I just mentioned. So Pablo Mora, incredible person, is this link between the indigenous world and the academia and filmmaking kind of society. And he's a person who's just really, really important in Colombia in relation to indigenous filmmaking. And one of the things he said in relation to films made by external filmmakers in the region was this, and I found it really, really important. So he said, the author maintains the privilege of speaking through the voices, segmenting them, reorganizing them, mutilating them, distorting them, which is what is commonly done in the halls of editing, without the uncomfortable presence of those represented, questioning the directors with their considerations on correspondence, truthfulness, and self-image. And it was just really, really the moment, together with all the things I realized when I felt really arrogant, really thinking about all the preconceptions I came with in the region, I just really, really became completely obsessed with this idea of decolonizing local knowledge, just looking at what is there before just having my own ideas what should be done. So very briefly, I'm kind of trying to skim through quite quickly here, but hopefully everyone here will agree with me that research is not just for academics, and it should benefit society, it should contribute to knowledge, and it should help us understand things. And I'm not going to talk about in detail about the project I'm working on right now, but this idea of kind of looking at local communities and just trying to see how what I can contribute can help them create a long-term sustainable digital creative economy, in this case in Pacific Islands, is kind of at the very center, at the very core of the way I want to take my future projects going forward. Another things which I really find fascinating in relation to practice-based research in film are taken from examples of PhD students I currently supervise, where this idea of making, in this case film, is just really the best way to answer their research questions. So some of the examples they're working on is Kurdish cinema beyond victimhood, and they just produce the example of how it can look like, or representing female body in film by female directors in the Middle East. So this is going to be obviously addressed by making this film by my female PhD candidate. Really fascinating things. Oops. Another thing, very briefly, last section I'm talking about is this outputs. So as you probably realize, I'm really, really passionate about just really trying to understand what can happen with these things. So one of the things I conceived last year is this international conference and festival. I called it Communities and Communication. And the idea was to bring this creative work and academia research together into one big event. And that was something which I organized with 2 colleagues of mine from the department. And we were just really overwhelmed by the responses, because we received almost 2,500 submissions from 105 countries all around the world. And what we were accepting was films, papers, and posters. And it was just really unexpected. Because of course there was no legacy to this festival. It just happened, we just invented it. So I'm currently working on the next year's edition. It's going to be called Diverse Voices. And what I want to do is to bring, expand it more in terms of bringing artworks and other non-conventional submissions, because what I realized, there is a need for this kind of conversation when these two seemingly separate things, research and creative work, can be brought together, and some fantastic things can happen afterwards. So in conclusions, really, really important things for me. It's not about giving voices, because these voices already exist locally, but it's about tuning to local perspective. This decolonized approach is really about collaborating on equal rights. The practice, both in terms of the process and the final artifact, leads the way to answer research questions in so many exciting ways, and there's so much potential over there. It's just really fascinating. And these outcomes have a potential to become more accessible and relatable to general public. And then, so my main focus these days is really just about creating and contributing to multiple diverse platforms for disseminations made available. So I'm creating a research group, which is called Film as Research Practice. I was really privileged recently to get a managing editor job at the International Journal of Creative Media Research, which is really a platform for this kind of contributions. And I actively contribute in other networks, such as Corkscrew Practice Research Network at my previous institution, Birkbeck in London. So I guess that's it. This is my email, my website, and a very easy to remember Twitter handle, Following Red. So I'll be really delighted to hear from anyone who is interested in similar research or anything to do with practice-based research in creative arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agata. So 2 really, really interesting conversations and presentations there. We are going to open it up to the floor to some questions from attendees now. So please do use the Q&A function below if you have any questions for Claire and Agata. And I've just noticed that because this isn't a webinar, I don't think that there is a Q&A function, or I can't see one at the bottom. So if you just pop your questions in the chat, we'll do it that way instead. Do feel free to pop on your camera as well, just so we can see who we're talking with, but if you're not comfortable, then please don't worry. As we wait for a few questions to come through, I'd like to use my chair's privilege to be able to ask you some of my own questions. So I'll start off with Claire. So really interesting talk, and I was particularly interested in this concept of the textual stage. And like I said in the chat, the periodicals and the kind of that exchange of views really sounds like a modern day Twitter, a modern day kind of social media. So I'm just wondering, on your work, is that something that you're going to draw comparisons with, or how do you consider the way that this textual stage has evolved from the periodical to kind of social media as we know it?
Yeah, so the parallels are definitely there, and I think one of the things I was most struck by when a few years ago I started looking at these periodicals was that there were a lot of the articles that you feel like you could take and with very little tweaking could become a blog. You know, and in a way that's quite dispiriting, in the sense that perhaps the conversation hasn't actually moved on as much as you might have expected between sort of now and say 150 years ago. The Conway Hall, which is a humanist secular society based in London that has its roots in the 19th century, did an exhibition a couple of years ago called Victorian Blogging, which was looking specifically at the pamphlets coming out of these kinds of movements. So I think people have also already sort of thought about how these things fit together. But I am really interested in thinking about the similarities in the threads, but also the differences as well. And I think the main difference, I suppose, is the role of the editor. So the editors, as I said, these are open spaces. The correspondence, the open columns quite often have the kind of caveat at the top of them saying that the editor isn't responsible for any opinions here. So that's they sort of pretend they have this sort of separate, this sort of hands-off approach, but of course they're actually very involved in mediating what is and isn't published. And so you have, and especially because a lot of the editors are actually the major figures within the movement. So people like George W. Foote, you see on my slide, was the editor of the Free Thinker. Saladin, William Stuart Ross, was the Secular Agnostic Review. And so they're very enmeshed. They have a lot of stake in the conversations that are happening. And so I think the main difference between where we were sort of in the 19th century and how text proliferates in a sort of social media and sort of internet space is that there is still this mediation of how these debates are shaped. And I think as a result, the debates that you see through correspondence columns I suppose have more shape, that there's sort of a decision being made about who is and isn't printed. And even though when it seems that there are sort of multiple voices and multiple perspectives, which there are, there's still a thread that's being run through where there is someone behind the scenes making those choices. And whereas I think today the idea of sort of moderation, I suppose it still exists in the sense, below the line comments on a newspaper website, there is moderation that happens, but actually it's not the same as the printed readers' letters you find in a newspaper that still obviously exist today as well. So I think that's the major difference. But in terms of the discussions and the debates that are actually happening, I think one of the most surprising things potentially is how little some of the main discourses have actually evolved or changed. You still have people thinking that you can challenge faith with reason, and I think those two things don't actually function as a sort of level platform for debate in the first place. No,
it's a really interesting comparisons and similarities, and it's quite interesting to draw out. You say they're discussing kind of similar things. So I have a question for Agata as well. Like I said, please do just, if you do have questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat, or if you'd like to use the raise hand function, you can do that as well. So my question for Agata is really interested in this concept kind of as art researchers art as well. And, that quote around kind of the editing process and kind of almost silence and voices. I suppose from your perspective, how would you almost avoid doing that in the editing process? Because that's probably quite difficult. And you said it wasn't so much about kind of silencing voices, it was about tuning into local voices. So how do you make sure that you don't tune out of those local voices during that editing process?
Yes,
and put your own biases and put your own lens on the photo.
That's a fantastic question, Helen. So thank you so much for this. And I think if you look at the history of documentary cinema, the question on how to do this has been really prevalent throughout the history, because it's a very difficult one. And my approach is that, and the way I approach it with the film I was making with them was just to basically make them part of the process. Because in this specific example, and there will be other examples of other documentary films for different purposes where it might look differently, but in my case, we are talking about a community which really suffered quite a lot in terms of being misrepresented by some people in the past. And I didn't have time to talk about it, but there were things from the 60s where they were presented as people who have pact with the devil, and they're not really anywhere near of being human. So, and this is their films where this kind of views are presented. So they're obviously not very nice. So they were quite, for many, many years, they were quite unhappy to just really let anyone in terms of just allow people from the outside. to make anything about themselves, especially because they were already proposing their own versions of, well, we are self-representing themselves. But then I think years after, they just realized that they can still use it as a way of really equal collaborations, and just it could be something which contributes towards the goal they're trying to achieve. And so what I did, because I spent nearly 4 months with them, and I already finished my different stages of editing when I was there, and they were part of it. So we almost had like a little popcorn party screening towards the end of the thing. And I just really wanted to make sure that they were happy with the way they're represented. Now, you can argue that it's still problematic because it kind of brings you back to question, whom are you trying to please almost with your film? And it's a very, very complex ethical issue, but it's also a complex issue in terms of what your research really is about. So there's lots of questions to be considered, but definitely one thing is to just really make sure you remain in communication with the people, and they are at least in some kind of agreement with what you're trying to do.
Really interesting. It's like, what reality are you presenting? Because is it, co-collaboration, is it the reality that the communities want you to present and say, yes, I'm happy with that? Or is it the reality of how you see it? It's, yeah, that's, like I say, it's really, really difficult in terms of how you present that and the ethical issues that come along.
Yes.
Well, I think one last shout out for questions. I think if we don't have anything, I think let's start out the breakout room and open up the discussion without kind of UKRI colleagues being present. So Sue, could I ask you to sort out a breakout room? What we'll do, we'll just have the one breakout room where people can kind of can join in and have a discussion about the research. And if you'd like them to continue the discussion from there, please feel free.